Hello and welcome. Today, gems from the EMI Columbia HMV catalogue. Kind of like what I'm doing with the Decca catalogue, except in this case it's the other main British recording company. Now, some of you may be a little confused by the inclusion of the name Columbia. You associate that more with the American label, CBS, now Sony. Well, it's a very long, complicated story, but for a period of time, EMI had the rights to the Columbia name, and they used it on many of their records, their classical records from the 60s. Well, we've got a lot of fantastic records to get through, ranging from very early stereo right through to the end of the analog era. EMI just quickly had a slightly different sound to the Decca records, whereas with the Decca records you had a feeling of being more or less where the conductor was. That's because their main microphones, which were in the form of the Decca tree, stood on a tripod, 3 microphones above the conductor's head. EMI recordings had more of a mid-hall sound. The other thing I think it's reasonable to say is that early pressings, which are very prized by collectors, mainly because many of these early records were never reissued later, and also because just the whole collector thing about trying to go for early pressings, preferably tube mastered pressings. In the case of EMI Columbia at that time, to be honest, the sound quality of the pressings is more variable. You can come across records which are absolute gems and others which are not so great. One thing you can say though about EMI HMV records as we move through time, sort of the late 60s, 70s, the British pressings and reissues sound really good. So if you don't want to pay the top dollar for an original or early pressing, go for the reissues. They sound really, really great. Whatever you do, do not buy American pressings, which are mainly on the Angel Records imprint. They sound horrendous. Avoid like the plague, except once you get into the digital era. Digital pressings made in America sound pretty much the same as the English equivalents. Anyway, having said that, let's embark on some of these wonderful records. I'm going to start with one of the great violinists, and he recorded on, first of all, on Russian Melodia, which was released by EMI, and we'll be seeing some examples of that later. But then he also recorded on EMI proper. Anything by Oistrakh is wonderful. I mean, for me, we're really two violinists. It's just their records are wonderful. It's Oistrakh and it's Nathan Milstein. Both of them recorded on Columbia, EMI. Anyway, I picked out this record. This is him doing one of the Mozart concertos and then one of the Prokofiev concertos. Now, this is an early pressing, if not the first pressing, probably. These are distinguished. They had these little gold labels on them. And then the record itself, the label, had this wonderful blue label. Quite lovely. And these are the most highly prized versions of these records, these early ones. But like I say, you can go for one of the reissues later on and it's going to sound great. There are a couple of excellent box sets gathering together a lot of Oistrakh's recordings, and those I can recommend those all without reservation. Now, EMI, like Decca, had its own roster of conductors. There was sometimes some crossover, but they tended to ally themselves to a particular label. One of the most popular and fantastic conductors on Columbia at this period was Carlo Maria Giulini. And I love all these records that he put out, mainly, if not exclusively, recorded with the Philharmonia Orchestra. The Philharmonia Orchestra was basically EMI's in-house orchestra, created by Walter Legg, who was one of their main record producers, and he basically used it as his own private orchestra. The main conductors he had working with the Philharmonia were Giulini, Herbert von Karajan, and then Otto Klemperer. I love these Giulini records. They're all very special. And again, you've got the blue label like that. This particular record is of Fire, the Three-Cornered Hat, and then the very popular suite, the second suite from Daphnis and Chloe by Ravel, and also Alvarado del Grazioso. This is a lovely record. The other conductor I mentioned is Otto Klemperer. Now, Otto Klemperer tends to be more associated with the mainstream Germanic repertoire, so obviously Beethoven, Brahms, Wagner. I have many of those records. They're great, but I picked out one which is really unusual, not repertoire you associate with him, but this is a terrific record. And look at that artwork. Isn't that splendid? There we go. This is him doing music from Kurt Weill's Threepenny Opera, which is kind of a seminal piece from the Weimar era in Germany. And then he's doing, of all things, music by Johann Strauss. It's most extraordinary, but beautifully done. We've got the Vienna Blut Waltz, the Overture to Die Fledermaus, and the Kaiser Waltz, the Emperor Waltz. And then we've actually got a quick piece by Klemperer himself called The Merry Waltz. Again, this is an original pressing. It sounds wonderful. And it's also, when I got this copy, it also had its original inner sleeve. When the old records like this, I tend to keep the inner sleeves because they're just kind of fun. And here you see, and it's got the roster of different artists recording on EMI Columbia. They're all there. And then behind, you've got some of the halls which they recorded in. Isn't that fun, just to have that? You always have to take the records out of their original sleeves. Many of the sleeves, especially on Decca, they use plastic and it can leach into the record. So if you buy these things secondhand, you definitely want to clean them properly on a vacuum machine or something similar, and then put them into a fresh sleeve. Moving on, a conductor who was an absolute mainstay of EMI in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and I don't think there's a record of his I wouldn't buy, and that is Andre Previn. And they've just actually issued a huge CD box set of all his recordings for EMI, a great way to actually just get it all at once. But nothing beats the records. And I could have picked so many. I will be doing a video later on about Previn. I'll probably do several videos. So I thought, well, what should I pick? And interestingly, for an American conductor, he was very, very good at English music. And obviously, English music was a major part of the EMI catalogue. And this record is him conducting two British composers, William Walton, the Second Symphony, and then a lesser known piece, certainly not known to Americans, by a composer called Constant Lambert, and it's called the Rio Grande. We've also got a couple of overtures by Walton in here. Now the thing is, one of Previn's most famous records, and still to this day, the best recording, is his recording on RCA of the Walton First Symphony. It's just a killer record with the London Symphony Orchestra. Some years later, he does this one of the Second Symphony, which is not a symphony on the scale of the first, but it's a really terrific piece and actually deserves to be done more often. And EMI often had wonderful artwork, as you can see on this one. Great fun. Another main conductor on the EMI label, all his recordings of English music are just the non-pareil, was Sir Adrian Boult. And this is one of his records which people may not know so well. It's all music of Elgar, but it's really interesting because you've got music from, you've got his sort of symphonic suite called Falstaff, inspired by the character in Shakespeare, features in The Merry Wives of Windsor and Henry IV, Part 1 and 2, a rather large, bloated individual who sort of parades himself through these various adventures, always getting himself into trouble. Then you've got music from The Sanguine Fan, but the piece on this record, which is just, was such a surprise to me when I first heard it. I actually heard it in a music history class when I was in high school. We had a teacher who had the most amazing record collection, and 78s, which he had inherited from his great-grandfather, the English composer John Stainer. And anyway, so when we went for music history classes, he would often illustrate, you know, both from records like this and or from 78s, and he had the most spectacular 78 machine with a huge papier-mâché horn, which he would point at the wall, and he only used the sort of hand-carved little quill needles on that thing. I mean, it sounded great. But anyway, he played this record, and it's an orchestration by Elgar of Bach, the Fantasia and Fugue in C minor. And it's one of my favorite orchestrations of Bach. It's tremendous. this record has really, really great sound. Yes, it's the famous recording duo of, well, the producer was Christopher Bishop, the balance engineer was Christopher Parker on this one, also another great balance engineer, Stuart Eltham. The Bishop-Parker team, they recorded all the Previn records and many others besides, and they're as legendary in their own way as Kenneth Wilkinson is on Decca. But this is also available in a mobile fidelity reissue on 4 sides, and it sounds even better than this. Reissues from mobile fidelity from the 80s, 70s, 80s, they're not necessarily as good sounding as the original records, but in this case, it really rocks. So that's another way to go with this record. Now, a composer that EMI brought on in the 70s to specialize in Scandinavian music was this guy, Paavo Berglund. And he did a rightly very revered cycle of the Sibelius symphonies. And that early cycle on EMI of all the Sibelius symphonies is highly prized. I have it. It's terrific. I will talk about it in another video. But I wanted to mention this record, which is one he did of the Nielsen Fifth Symphony. This is Nielsen's most popular symphony. It's the one which has a section where basically a snare drum is told to play fortissimo, and he's told to ad-lib, play whatever he wants, improvise. And his purpose is to try and disrupt the proceedings in the rest of the orchestra. It's a most extraordinary passage of music. Anyway, all these Paavo Berglund records are terrific. If you see them, snap them up. Again, English pressings. And this was another very good recording team. The producer was David Motley, and the balance engineer again was Stuart Eltham. Highly recommended. Another conductor who featured on EMI was Rudolph Kemper, and in particular his recordings of the Strauss, Richard Strauss tone poems are highly, highly prized. You can buy several box sets on either EMI or German Electrola of his recordings with the Dresden Staatskapelle, and highly recommended. They are in many ways the benchmark performances of Richard Strauss. I mean, there are other conductors I love in Strauss, in particular Karajan, but those Kemper recordings are superb, and it's with the Dresden Staatskapelle, which for me is one of the best orchestras ever. We didn't get so many recordings of them back in the day because, of course, they were stuck in East Germany, but nowadays more recordings come out. I've heard them live a number of times. They just have the most delicious, rich sonority, gorgeous strings, gorgeous wind and brass, perfect for Strauss. But this record is an earlier recording of Richard Strauss, his tone poem Don Quixote, but this one is with the Berlin Philharmonic, no slouch in the orchestra department. The cello soloist is one of my favorite cellists, Paul Tortelier, and this recording was made in 1958. This is a reissue on Testament. Testament is a reissue label. They're not as highly thought of or prized as Speaker's Corner, for example, but they do very nice reissues of some really rare stuff in the EMI catalogue, and they often stay in print for a long time. It's one of my favorite Strauss tone poems. It tells the story, obviously, of Don Quixote, and very pictorial, lots of action going on, and then beautiful end as the night dies. And this is a stunning record. And, you know, it's done on 180 gram. They've reproduced, again, it's not the blue label that EMI, but they also sometimes had this gold label, cream and gold label, for their early issues. If you've watched my other video about records off the beaten track, I showed a record by the King's Singers called Contemporary Collection, which was of modern music. Well, EMI in the 70s started this sort of separate imprint which specialized in modern music. And here's one of a series of records they recorded with the great Polish composer Penderecki, whose most famous work probably is St. Luke Passion. Now, all the records in this series had this sort of striped effect that you see here. And this is a really interesting collection of music. Now, some of you may go, oh, who's Penderecki? Well, actually, if you've ever watched The Shining, you know a lot of his music, and some of it is on here. Kubrick used a whole bunch of it in The Shining. In particular, The Dream of Jacob and De Natura Sonoris No. 1. The other, it's a seminal piece, 20th century piece that's on here, is the Threnody to the Victims of Hiroshima. This is a piece written just for string orchestra to commemorate the Hiroshima bombing. And he uses strings in ways that no one had really used strings before, using every aspect of the instrument, percussive, screeching, all of that. And this is a sensational recording. It will make the hair curl on the back of your neck. Changing gear again, solo piano music. I mean, there are so many pianists I could talk about and will talk about in the future. One of my favorite from the 70s, he kind of burst on the scene in the 70s, and actually my piano teacher took me and a couple of his other pupils to see a very early recital by this guy, and it was in a funny little hall somewhere. He wasn't really well known yet, but I was sold on this guy, and that is Dmitri Alexeyev. There are two pianists, Russian pianists from this period, who really made a huge impact on EMI. This guy and Andrei Gavrilov, and the records of both of them are really worth seeking out. But he did two records, this is the second one, of piano music by Brahms. And the Brahms piano music is maybe not so well known, but it's absolutely charming and delightful. A lot of these pieces are miniatures, and I guess for years the benchmark recording of Brahms piano solo repertoire is the Decca box with Julius Katchen, and I have that, and it's really wonderful. But these were the records that introduced me to this pianist on record and to this music. I didn't play Brahms on the piano. It was rather too difficult for me. It's very difficult to play, and I was not primarily a pianist by any means. But I highly recommend these two records. Another mainstay of the EMI repertoire was English choral music, and the choir of King's College, Cambridge. I mean, there are so many legendary records made by the King's College Choir. They were first recording on Decca, and then they moved over to EMI. Their most famous choir director was David Wilcox, and I actually had the great experience when I started at my high school. I sang in our chapel choir, and we were a sister foundation to King's and to Winchester, and every couple of years all three choirs would get together at one of the three churches, chapels, cathedrals, whatever you want to call them, and we would do a combined evensong. And my very first term in high school, we did a combined evensong with Winchester and with King's in King's, and it was just before David Wilcox retired, and it was an extraordinary experience for me. Memorable also because after the rehearsal we had a few hours to ourselves, and we were told we could go off and do what we wanted, provided we were back in time to do the service. And a bunch of boys went down to the river and went punting and actually fell in the water, and they turned up to sing the service. There was no time to get changed, so they just put their cassocks on, robes and cassocks on, over their wet clothes, and I guess serve them right. But anyway, this record is a favorite. This is music by Benjamin Britten, and also the arrangement that Bernstein did of his Chichester Psalms, one of his greatest pieces. And if you've never heard it, you need to investigate it. You should check out Bernstein's own recording. But I really like this recording, in which he's downsized the orchestra to basically organ, harp, and percussion. And this is conducted by Philip Ledger, who succeeded Wilcox as the music director at King's. And we've also got Britten's Rejoice in the Lamb, another piece that I sang, the Te Deum and Jubilate Deo. And actually a couple of the soloists on here ended up coming to our choir. Simon Channing, I think Rory Phillips came as well. Anyway, one of so many great King's College Choir records that are on EMI. Here's something a little unusual. I mean, like Decca, EMI had all these budget labels where they did reissues or did new recordings of repertoire, but they released it initially on these budget price labels. And one of them they did was HMV Greensleeve, and this is just a lovely selection of music by Eric Satie, orchestrated as it was used for a production by the Royal Ballet called Monotones. So you've got all the famous Satie pieces like Nocienne, Gymnopédie, etc., but orchestrated beautifully. Some of them are orchestrations by Debussy, some of them orchestrated by Darius Milhaud, another French composer, and some of them orchestrated by the conductor of this, John Lanchbury, who was the main conductor of the Royal Ballet Orchestra, which was basically the orchestra of the Royal Opera House, Covent Garden. That's who's playing on this. This is an absolutely delightful record, and you can find this for practically nothing. So I thought I'd finish up with a little group of records of Russian music. Now, EMI had a relationship with the Russian state recording entity, which was called Melodia, and EMI put out a lot of these Melodia recordings on EMI. And for anyone who's interested in 20th century music, in Russian music, these are just a source of endless delight. What's great about these EMI releases is, of course, the pressings are infinitely superior to the ones put out by Melodia itself. So go for the EMI pressings. I'm going to start with a really nice box of music by a very famous Russian composer, but you probably don't know these pieces. And these are Tchaikovsky's string quartets, and they're played by the great Russian quartet, the Borodin Quartet, and the great Russian cellist Miroslav Rostropovich is also featured on some of the extra, I think it's the Souvenir de Florence, yes. These have all the virtues of Tchaikovsky's more familiar music, but string quartet, it's new, it's fresh, and these are really nice recordings, highly recommended. Of course, it comes with a nice book. They always have, Decca, EMI, this period, they have really nice booklets with great notes and pictures. So all in all, a delightful package if you want to explore some music you may not otherwise know. Next, a record which is kind of a one-off and which has become one of those records which audiophiles are always on the hunt for. And this is music by Rachmaninoff, orchestrated by Respighi, the Etude Tableau, originally written for piano, and then music by Tchaikovsky. And it's kind of I believe this is pretty much the only record he ever did, this conductor Yuri Krasnopolsky, with the Philharmonia Orchestra. So this is not a Melodia issue, I just haste to mention. This is actually recorded by EMI, by the team of John Willen and balance engineer Stuart Eltham, who we've come across before. And there's this conductor. And the sound on this thing it's worthy of its audiophile status. It's a really fun record. This might be a little pricey to buy. I wish one of the reissue labels would do it, like Testament, for example. A really fun record of music, just glittering, exciting, all that fantastic Russian Slavic quality. Highly recommended. In conclusion, more Russian music, and here a real blockbuster, but again, a set, it's actually a 2-record set, you may not be aware of. It comes from the very end of the analog era, and it's film music. Now, as you know from my channel, I'm very into film music, and the most famous film music by a Russian is Prokofiev's Alexander Nevsky, which he turned into an oratorio from the film by Eisenstein. But this is of his other great film score, Ivan the Terrible. And this is just a knock 'em dead recording done by Riccardo Muti. This just takes the roof off. It's got a great booklet here. There's Mr. Muti. And then it's got all the text and everything. And you've got stills from the film. All this wonderful stuff. Here we go. It's with the, I think it's the Philharmonia. Yeah, it's the Philharmonia with the Ambrosian chorus. And what they've done is they've got a narrator speaking in Russian between the pieces of music. You've got mezzo-soprano Irina Arkhipova, baritone Anatoly Mokrenko. This thing is just, it's just a blast. And at the end, when you get into the dance of the Oprichniki, I think that's what they're called. Yes. And then their big final chorus. This thing is just sensational. It also includes the Sinfonietta on the fourth side. Look at that. Isn't that great? I very rarely see this around, especially in an English pressing. It's worth seeking out if you're into Prokofiev film music. This is just terrific. So there we have it. That is my selection of gems from the EMI HMV Columbia catalogue for today. There'll be plenty more in future videos. As always, please like, subscribe if you feel so inclined to do. And until next time, happy listening. Many thanks. Good night.